Well, we finally made it to the video where I get to show you how to put it all together. If you've followed along this far and you've enjoyed learning how to make your moccasin pattern to fit your foot, learning how to bead, where to get supplies, and how to prep them for assembly, please hit subscribe because I've got way more ideas to share with you. The first thing to put together is the lining. I've gathered the supplies I need to start. I've got my threaded needle with a knot tied in the end of the thread. I've got my lining fabric pre-cut with my vamp and my bottom. If you don't know how we came to this, you may want to check back with my playlist. It'll take you through all the steps, creating the pattern, getting the materials, and prepping them for assembly. I've also got 5 baby binder clips and my scissors. That's all I'll need to put my lining together. The first thing we're going to do is clip everything in place for the toe. I'm going to match the corner of my vamp with the bottom notch, and the top notch should match with the other notch on the side of the bottom. Notice I've put these fluffy sides together, and this is for my right foot, and that they match. Very important. I'm going to place a clip anywhere that there's a notch on that side. You can also use pins. I just have the clips handy because that's what I use to temporarily hold the leather together because pins don't work. Same thing on this side. I'm going to pull this all the way over. That's what makes space for your foot. And place clips anywhere there's a notch. Lastly, I need to match up these 2 notches and place a clip there. So you can see how this is already taking shape as a shoe. The first section we're going to actually sew together is going to be the spaces between these 2 clips. To do that, I've got my needle and thread. I am using a dark thread, like I said, so that you can see my stitches, but I'd recommend you use a color that matches your lining. I'll take the 1 clip out because I can hold this in place while I get it started, and I'm going to do a locking whip stitch. If you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say that, jump to my hand stitching video. The link is in the top right corner right now, and then come on back once you're a master of the locking whip stitch. When I very first get going at this corner, I like to do a few whip stitches all in one spot because that's where your foot's going to be going in and out, and it needs a lot of strength. Now that that's done, I'll use my locking whip stitch to sew only up to the next notch. Now I've come up to the clip, I can remove it. I've reached the notch. I'm going to stop sewing here and tie my knot. To tie a knot, I like to just scoop up a little sliver of fabric, do that 3 or 4 times in the same spot, and then you're good to cut it off. Wonderful. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. Now that I've got both the sides sewn together, I'm going to start working on the toe. The toe is going to be a little bit different, and if you watched that hand stitch video, you will have seen the effect we're going for. The toe needs these little puckers in it to create shape for your foot, to create the depth in the toe of the shoe. So I'm going to show you how to create those puckers. We're going to start both times right at the top, right at the notch. I'm going to sew through this top notch a few times to get my thread really well anchored. Then, because I have more fabric here than I have here, this is the edge that's going to need to fold into puckers to create that depth. If it helps you to visualize it, you can place a clip around the halfway point so you know how much fabric you need to use up. Now, just like we did in the hand stitching video, I'm going to push up a little fold of fabric, just 1 little fold of fabric, and then do a locking whip stitch. I'll do that again, push up a little fold of fabric, and then do a locking whip stitch to hold it in place. So you can see bit by bit, I'm nibbling away at this excess fabric by feeding it into little folds along the edge of the toe. There's half my toe done. You can see the nice little ripples all the way along and the way it creates shape for the toe, and then how those little ripples disappear when we get to the side seam that we did the first time. I'm going to start at the top again and repeat on this side, but I wanted to give you a quick note. If you find you've used up all your fabric and all you have left is something nice and straight, just sew it straight. Don't keep using up fabric because you're going to create a problem on your vamp. So use up only as much fabric as you need to, and then just sew the rest out flat as you did the side seam here. All right, I'm going to do this other side the same way. Okay, so here I've come to a place where I've used up the rest of that excess fabric. I'm just going to sew this straight down. And that's it for the toe. All the gathers have pulled the bottom of the shoe up to the top and made some depth for your foot. All that's left to do now is the heel. To get the heel started, we're going to simply close these two together. I can even clip it. And then we'll just sew straight down this back seam. You can use just about any of the stitches that were discussed in the last video. I'm going to use a back stitch. There's my finished back stitched heel. That was easy, hey? We're getting closer to it looking like a shoe. The very last thing we need to do is deal with this little heel flap. All I'm going to do is fold it up flat, and I'll show you the stitch we're going to use for that. I've got my needle and thread here. I'm just going to slide it under the corner to go through the flap, and then right across from it, I'm going to scoop up a little bit of fabric and then duck under the heel flap again. I'll show you that again. I'm going to scoop up a little bit of fabric and then duck under the heel flap again. And it's going to make a bunch of nice little stitches that cover the edge of your fabric. And I'll go all the way around. There you are. That is it for the lining. Now all we need to do is put together the leather and the fur, and your moccasins will be done. The first area we're going to work on is getting the piping around the vamp. The reason we have piping is to fill that seam a bit and provide a nice finish. In our case, we're using a strip of leather that we've cut off of our main hide. Here's my beaded vamp I worked so hard on, and I'm going to start clipping this leather to the edge of that vamp. Now that I'm at the corner, you can see it doesn't want to lie flat, but we actually don't care. All we care about is ensuring that the edges of the leather matches the edge of the vamp. Now truly, you could use more clips than I have here. I just didn't quite bring enough with me today. I'm going to snip off the excess, and then I'm going to use a simple whip stitch to attach these pieces together. To do that, I've got my leather thread knotted at the end and my leather needle. If you have any questions about supplies, prepping the supplies, how to bead, what is even going on here, please check out my playlist because that will have the answers to all of your questions. Here's a link to it. All right, we're going to whip stitch this leather piece onto the vamp using our leather needle and leather thread. Whip stitch is very simple and quick, and I'm using it here because I'm only really just temporarily holding this together. Once I sew it into the shoe, it'll be held much more securely. So for that reason also, I am breaking my 5mm rule, and these stitches are long. And there it is. It doesn't look great right now, but I promise it will once we put it together. Okay, now comes the time to attach the vamp to the rest of the moccasin. Always a good idea here is to lay out both your pieces and make sure you know which foot is left and which foot is right. This is obviously my left foot, so I want to find the one that is also my left foot. I can tell right now I've got a right and a left. When I step into it, I'll be stepping onto the bad side of the leather though, which means this one is my left foot. When I flip it back over and place my vamp right side down, it should match, and it does. We're good. We're good here. Now, if you remember from making your lining, the very first thing we did here were these two sections between the notches, and we're going to do exactly the same thing on here. So that means first clipping the pattern together anywhere that there's a notch. Next, using a locking whip stitch to sew together the two sections that are between these clips. You can trim off your notches once they've served their purpose of letting you know how to line up your pattern pieces. Cutting off my notches. First side is done, now on to the second side. There we go. Now both sides are done. I can move on to the toe. If you remember from when you did your lining, the toe needs to have all these little puckers. Let's do a quick review of how that happens. First, we always start at the top so that all the puckers will be concentrated at the toe, not weirdly down here. I'm going to anchor my thread really good by doing a couple whip stitches on the spot first. Once that's done, I have a look at how much fabric I need to use up, and I do that bit by creating just a little fold of fabric here and then doing a locking whip stitch to hold it in place. Locking whip stitch again is one where we go through the same space twice. 1, 2, because we don't want our hard work little bubbles to come unbubbled. So that's what it looks like when it's done. I'm going to continue doing that, folding up a little piece at a time until I've used up all this extra fabric. That side's all done. Now for the other side. All right, that's both sides done. If you like, you can leave it at that. I like to do a back stitch all the way around the puckered parts because I find it smooths it out really nicely and gives a beautiful finish. Here you can see where the puckers are nicely back stitched down, and here not so much. All right, now I have finished my back stitching all along the edge, and you can see how it flattens it out quite nicely. Let's check our handiwork. Here's the big reveal. And there it is. The only thing left to do now is we're going to trim down this strip so it's nice and short. And there it is, our finished toe. I like to try and train the leather to sit flat, so I roll this seam now all the way around to really convince it that it's going to be in this shape now. Moving right along, we are about to sew up the heel. This is going to go very similarly to the lining, but the first thing we're going to want to do that's different is we want to put in a strip like this along the back of the heel. To do that, I'll flip this guy over and place my leather strip along one edge of the back. I'm going to cut it to the right length, and then I'll whip stitch it into place. Now that that's done, I know this feels strange because it's upside down and inside out, but we are going to flip these together this way and then whip stitch this back seam together through all 3 layers. And finally, I'm going to back stitch through everything so it's extra secure. I'm finishing this off by doing a whip stitch over the top edge a few times in the same spot. Now that that's all done, I can flip this to the right side and trim down that little leather piece just like I did all around the toe. And that's the finished heel. Our last bit of sewing is to fold up the heel flap and sew it down. I'm going to slide my needle right underneath the corner. This is exactly like the lining if you've been paying attention. And then through the lower part of the foot, back up through the heel flap. And then again through the main fabric, back up through the heel flap, and I'm going to do that all the way around. Now to keep my knot hidden, I'm going to send my thread on into the inside of my moccasin, and I'll tie it off by going through this edge of leather 3 or 4 times. All right, that's it. You're ready to slide your lining into your moccasin. This takes a little bit of wiggling and doing, but I found a cheat for this, and that is to fold the toe into itself and then line up this edge with this edge. And then I can push the toe into itself once it's already inside. Slide the heel into the heel, and generally it takes a little bit of massaging to get everything really nice and smooth. But now we're ready to sew those two together, and then all that's left is the fur. This is going to get sewn together in one piece with a simple whip stitch all the way around as though it's a circle. These stitches are wider than 5 millimeters. That's because they are not actually going to be holding anything together. They're just a way of keeping our layers where we want them when we put the fur on. If I pull it a little bit tightly as I go, you'll see I can bring this into a nicer shape for a shoe. Okay, now that that's done, I'm ready to put on the fur. I've got my strip of rabbit fur here, and there is a very specific way we need to place this in to make it all work out exactly the way we want. And that way is make sure the end of your strip of fur matches your back seam of your moccasin. Make sure the fluffy, furry side is kissing the fluffy side of your moccasin. Lastly, make sure the side of your fur strip where the hairs hang off of, notice they don't hang off on this way, the grain of the fur is pointing down. So begin at the center back, fluffy sides kissing, and furry bits pointing down. Very technical sewing language. I am going to sew this on with a locking whip stitch all the way in a circle. All right, now that I'm back where I started, I can see how much more I need in order to be able to reach back to the beginning of my fur and have enough to sew them together. So I'm going to cut this right here. Remember from our prepping video, we never use scissors on fur because it cuts the hairs and we only want to cut the hide. So I lift the fur off the tabletop so that there's absolutely no pressure on the hairs and cut it like that. Now, I'll flip the fur up, match it along the back here, and sew that together using a locking whip stitch. I'm pushing all the hairs down because I want them to stay nice and fluffy and not get caught in my seam. Now that I've done that, this is the fun part, the great reveal. I can pull the fur up and flip it over. And just like that, like magic, turns into a gorgeous little moccasin. If you've been following from the beginning, right from pattern making and how to get your supplies and what to do with them, congratulations, because this is the finish line. You have finished your moccasins. Thank you so much for watching. Happy sewing.